The footage you're looking at here is from a mobile video game called Free Fire. It doesn't look very impressive, does it? The graphics are pretty mediocre, and it looks like one of probably dozens, if not hundreds, of battle royale type games like Fortnite or PUBG. And yet it turns out that this is actually one of the most popular video games to ever exist. And if you're like me, one of over 300 million random residents of the United States, you've probably never even heard of it. And what's more, it's been out for almost an entire decade. So let's start with the obvious question. What exactly is Free Fire? Free Fire is a mobile, free-to-play, third-person, survival shooter, battle royale type game. You play in a given location against 49 other people in 10-minute bouts. Over the years, it's greatly expanded its character selection, weapons, and other types of content. So how did Free Fire come to be? The game was published by a Singaporean company named Garena. Garena was founded by Forrest Lee, a Chinese businessman who immigrated to Singapore in 2009. Lee realized at the time that while video games had become big business throughout the world, there were still plenty of areas that didn't have much of a market for that medium, Southeast Asia in particular being a great example of such. And so Lee decided that he would cater to these underserved markets. So Garena started its early life licensing popular video games from Western publishers. Things took a major turn when the company somehow managed to ink a deal with US-based video games publisher Riot Games to distribute its catalog of titles in Southeast Asia. One of those titles happened to be the wildly popular League of Legends. This practice of licensing other publishers' games was going pretty well for the company, but in 2014, Garena decided they wanted to create their own completely original title. And for that, they enlisted the aid of a very mysterious developer that was located in Vietnam called 111.studios. Finding info on this developer was surprisingly difficult. Normally, an easy way to find info on a game studio is to simply look up their website. Unfortunately, and surprisingly, they didn't appear to have one. So failing that, the second best course of action would be to go to their Wikipedia page. Turns out that too would be a problem, as they didn't have one either. An extremely tiny handful of well-known gaming websites do happen to have a page dedicated to them, but there's hardly anything on them. Even Moby Games, the best site on the internet for cataloging video game development credits, and one that I've used for research for exactly this sort of thing for around 20 years, they too didn't have much on them either. The only notable bit of info on those pages was that Free Fire was literally the only game they've worked on, ever. So we don't know how big the studio is, nor do we know who any of the key developers are. Seriously, there's hardly any info on the internet for them at all. And considering how much of a phenomenon Free Fire is, I find that all the more shocking. In all my research, I could only find 2 people who have plausibly worked on the actual creation of the game. And even these might be too much of a stretch. One of these people is Harold Teo, who worked on the game as the producer, and some guy named Andrew GM, which I'm assuming probably stands for General Manager. Andrew here is the only named individual in the developer blogs section on the Free Fire website. And like with everything else I found so far, this section sadly doesn't have much info on development either. There are only a handful of posts throughout the years, with the most recent one being from more than 2 years ago, from October 2023. We'll come back to this particular topic later on. In any case, after a roughly 3-year development cycle, the game was finally released in December 2017 and found near immediate success. By 2018, it was already the 3rd most downloaded game worldwide on Google Play and the 4th most downloaded overall. By 2019, it had generated $1 billion in revenue with 450 million users. Garena's market value skyrocketed from $1 billion in 2017 to $23 billion in 2020. And in 2021, it had reached a new milestone by topping 1 billion users worldwide, just on the Google Play Store. And as of the end of 2025, it's estimated that Free Fire has generated cumulative revenue of over $6 billion, with around 1.8 billion downloads. To date, it has the third highest viewership for esports of all time, with 5.4 million concurrent viewers, behind only League of Legends. So you guys get the message. Any way you slice it, Free Fire was a phenomenal success. But why was it so successful in the first place? Well, turns out there's quite a few reasons for that. First off, anyone who's into video games can tell you that gaming can be a very expensive hobby. We've seen the prices for video game consoles for this current generation, and they can definitely cost a pretty penny. There's not a console out there that's cheaper than $300, and even that is only due to years of price cuts. And if you want to get into PC gaming, a decent PC could run you anywhere from a couple of $100s to several thousand if you want a high-end system. Fortunately, when it comes to mobile gaming, the barrier to entry is much smaller. Over the past decade, the smartphone industry had made great strides, offering decently powered and capable phones without breaking the bank, which in turn allowed video games of all kinds of genres that were previously not suitable for mobile gaming to flourish. And in countries like India and Vietnam, countries that Garena specifically targeted, where incomes are generally much lower than they are in places like the US, Europe, and Japan, people are much more able to afford cheap smartphones. Suddenly, new markets and demographics had access to games in a way that wasn't possible or even imaginable just a few years prior. So Garena smartly released the game on smartphones and made sure it was able to run at low specs. Sure, playing in this form might not be the best experience, and the game may not win any beauty contests, but it's definitely acceptable enough for a lot of people who are interested in it to take the plunge. As Harold Teo explains, if our game is 4 gigabytes, 8 gigabytes or something, then people have to think twice about installing it. They have to delete some apps on their phone, and sometimes even the entire phone capacity might not be able to fit that sort of game. Even today, one of the team's priorities is to make the app as lightweight as possible. For reference, Free Fire's original incarnation in 2017 was only 200 megabytes, pretty much guaranteeing that it could be installed onto nearly any phone out there. So now you have a massive base of customers able to afford hardware needed to run the game. And to make it even easier, as mentioned earlier, the game itself is free, and that's a pretty enticing price for anyone. Sure, if you want additional content and such, you'd have to pay for it. But for Garena, the important thing was to make sure lots of people simply got a taste of their product. Another factor that helped Free Fire was Garena enlisting the aid of some of the biggest and most popular figures on the planet to advertise the game. Celebrities like Justin Bieber, Cristiano Ronaldo, and the K-pop band BTS were recruited by Garena. They've also done collaborations with all kinds of popular franchises, anime like Naruto and One Punch Man, video games like Street Fighter and Assassin's Creed, TV series like Money Heist and Squid Games from Netflix, and even car companies like Lamborghini. On top of that, Garena has specifically focused efforts on localization and tailors these collaborations and events specifically for that individual country. In an article from GameIndustry.biz, this goes beyond just the language of the game, extending to special events and content for different regions. For example, Olympic gold medalist Neeraj Chopra worked with Garena on the finals of the Free Fire India Championships, while Egyptian rapper Mohammed Ramadan was added to the game as a character. Big events and content, like the Money Heist one, or the Cristiano Ronaldo collaboration that we did in December 2020, are global collaborations that everyone will be able to enjoy. But localized content with local celebrities deliver a localized experience for Free Fire. It hits a little bit closer to home, and that's the kind of impact we want to create. So I wanted to circle back real quick to earlier in the video regarding the game's development. It's exactly because of the aforementioned stratospheric success of Free Fire that I'm puzzled at the fact that there's practically zero information on the studio that made it. It's genuinely both fascinating and baffling to me as someone who absolutely loves doing deep dives into the video game development process and has been following the development of probably more than 100 games for the past 20 years. I've never, or at the very least, rarely, encountered anything like this before. I mean, sure, there may be some incredibly forgettable, extremely niche games out there that were developed by some foreign developers in a third world country that sold like 500 copies, but this isn't one of those cases. Free Fire is one of the most successful and popular video games in history. It makes absolutely no sense to me why there's hardly any information on the people who created it. I mean, this is like not knowing who the people involved in making Super Mario Bros. Or Grand Theft Auto were. How does anyone in this day and age create such a ridiculously popular and successful video game and not get any credit whatsoever? This reminds me of how back in the super early days of video games, many decades ago, developers didn't get credited, or at best were allowed to use pseudonyms so that other companies wouldn't poach them. It was a terrible practice at the time that thankfully the industry had long since moved on from. But unfortunately, even in the modern age, still seems to exist to some degree. Anyway, so yeah, Free Fire is an extraordinarily successful game. But I imagine some of you watching this might be asking, wait, so what's the big deal about this? A non-American game is popular in non-American areas of the world, and me as a random American YouTuber is shocked that the world doesn't revolve around me. News at 11. But here's the thing, we currently live in a post-internet and post-globalization world. Back in, say, the 90s, where I grew up, something like this wouldn't be that surprising at all, because the world that existed at the time was very limited and very localized to whatever basically showed up on our TVs, theaters, and video game stores. But now we live in an interconnected world where things like anime and Korean dramas are known throughout the entire planet. Everyone is aware of the existence of, say, something like Pokemon, even if they've never played a single game, because that's just how ridiculously popular that franchise is. And that's kind of the way I feel about Free Fire. We're not talking about just a particular property from another country that is solely popular in that country. I'm sure lots of examples of such things exist, and something like that, while I do think would be interesting, wouldn't be nearly as interesting. At least not as interesting as this. No, we're talking about something that is wildly popular in not just one country, but in several major countries throughout the world. And given a footprint like that, you'd think it would be at least a little bit more well known in our neck of the woods as well. So yeah, I've never played the game, I have no interest in playing the game, and more than likely, will never play the game. But I think at the very least, I would have heard about it much sooner than I did. And yet here we are. I asked multiple friends of mine, both in real life and in certain message board and Discord spaces that I occupy, and none of them have heard of the game either. And yes, I understand this is completely anecdotal, but from what I've researched, I wouldn't at all doubt if this was definitely a much more widespread thing in general. When I was doing my research for the game, looking for videos on it on YouTube, there were hardly any videos, gameplay or otherwise, about Free Fire from an American or Western uploader. To give you an idea of what I'm talking about, let's have some fun with numbers. Garena doesn't have a YouTube page specifically for the United States, but instead has one for North America. It has around 400,000 subscribers, with 5 videos on the entire channel that are over 1 million views, the highest of which being 3.4 million, and the total amount of views on the channel being over 60 million. Not bad, I suppose. But turns out this is absolutely nothing compared to the YouTube channels from the other Free Fire territories. And from here it'll be made clear exactly what the gap in popularity is between the West and the rest of the world. If we go to Garena's Vietnam page, for example, they have nearly 6 million subscribers and 22 videos over 1 million views. their highest being 70 million, and the total view count being over 690 million. That's over 10 times more than the North American page. But as crazy as it might be, this is still around the low end. Their Brazil YouTube page, in comparison, has over 10 million subscribers, 78 videos over 1 million views, with the highest being 89 million, and their cumulative views being a whopping 1.2 billion. But it gets even more insane. Even numbers like those can't really compare to Free Fire's top performing market, India, which has 18 million subscribers, over 300 videos over 1 million views, the highest of which being 174 million, and total cumulative views being a staggering 3.7 billion. So yeah, hopefully that gets the point across a little bit better. This title is an absolute beast, and I've been fascinated with it since the moment I've heard about it. You see, I was made aware of the existence of this game from a very interesting Medium article by Felipe Pepe titled The Gentrification of Video Games. In it, he discusses how certain games are given attention and elevated by Western media, and how others are dismissed and ignored. And Free Fire was, of course, part of the latter. In its case, it was due to the fact that it was a free-to-play mobile game from Vietnam. It was a very interesting article that opened my eyes to the fact that there aren't just games, but even entire gaming industries that we in the West aren't even aware exist. Growing up, I was mostly exposed to video games from Japan and the US. The top 3 video game consoles since 1995, and most of the popular and critically acclaimed games for several decades came from those 2 countries. And sure, there were also places like the UK and South Korea, but they were quite a bit behind the other 2. After that, I didn't really give too much thought to the remaining markets. Oh sure, I was aware that countries like Brazil and India had their own video game scenes, but I always got the impression that they were relatively nascent and didn't really impact the video game industry as a whole very much. And in my case, it probably didn't help that I wasn't a big PC gamer either. So that limited my exposure to games from wider markets even further. There were many other examples mentioned in the article as well, but Free Fire in particular caught my eye, as the video game industry in both Vietnam and Singapore are extremely tiny compared to other countries, which makes the game's phenomenal success all the more impressive and fascinating. And I felt I absolutely had to learn more about this game and make a video on it. So it's kind of cool to discover video games are flourishing in countries that people in my neck of the woods might not be aware of. More people interested in video game development means more games for the rest of us, with probably more unique gameplay styles and stories and settings. Anyway, that pretty much wraps up this video. This was in many ways probably the most difficult video that I've made so far. There's several reasons for that, but mainly because, as I mentioned, there was hardly much info on this game, at least from primarily English-speaking sources. So it definitely took a lot of work, more so than usual, but hopefully you, the viewer, enjoyed it. Also, I'm quite happy that I just barely managed to finish this video before the new year. Additionally, I learned a few new things working on this video in terms of workflow, which made me realize I was doing quite a few things very inefficiently, and hopefully this means subsequent videos should go much smoother. So if you enjoyed this video or any other videos on my channel, I'd really appreciate it if you donated to my Patreon so I can make more of this type of content. Thanks a lot. I wish you all a happy holidays, and I will see you in 2026.